On their last day, in the morning, he shops for gifts for his in-laws, his mother, Sonia. It is the day Maushumi is presenting her paper. He has offered to go with her, to sit in the audience and listen to her speak. But she told him that was silly. Why sit in the middle of a room full of people speaking a language he doesn't understand, when there was still more of the city he could see? And so, after shopping, he sets off alone, for the Louvre, a destination he has put off until now. At the end of the day, he meets her at a cafe in the Latin Quarter. She is there waiting for him behind a glass-in partition on the sidewalk, wearing a dark red lipstick, sipping a glass of wine. He sits down, orders a coffee. How was it? How did it go? She lights a cigarette. Okay, over with, at any rate. She looks more regretful than relieved, her eyes lingering over the small round table between them, the veins in the marble bluish, like those in cheese. Normally she wants a full account of his adventures, but today they sit silently, watching the passer-bys. He shows her the things he has bought: a tie for his father-in-law, soaps for their mothers, a shirt for Samrat, a silk scarf for Sonia, sketchbooks for himself, bottles of ink, a pen. She admires the drawings he has done. It is a cafe they've been to before, and he feels the slight nostalgia it is sometimes possible to feel at the end of an extended stay in a foreign place, taking in the details that will soon evaporate from his mind. The surly waiter who has served them both times, the view of the shops across the street, the green and yellow straw chairs. Are you sad to be leaving? He asks, stirring sugar into his coffee, drinking it back in one gulp. A little. I guess a little part of me wishes I had never left Paris, you know. He leans over, takes both her hands in his. But then we would have never met, he says, with more confidence than he feels. True, she acknowledges, and then, maybe we'll move here one day. He nods. Maybe. She looks beautiful to him, tired, the concentrated light of the dying day on her face, infusing it with an amber pink glow. He watches the smoke drift away from her. He wants to remember this moment, the two of them together, here. This is how he wants to remember Paris. He takes out his camera, focusing it on her face. Nikhil, please, don't, she says, laughing, shaking her head. I look awful. She shields her face with the back of her hand. He still holds up the camera. Oh, come on, Mo. You're beautiful. You look great. But she refuses to indulge him, moving her chair out of view with a scrape on the pavement. She doesn't want to be mistaken for a tourist in this city, she says. A Saturday evening in May, a dinner party in Brooklyn. A dozen people are gathered around a long, scratched-up dining table, smoking cigarettes, drinking Chianti from juice glasses, sitting on a series of backless wooden stools. The room is dark, apart from a domed metal lamp hanging from a long cord, which casts a concentrated pool of light on the table's center. An opera plays on a battered boombox on the floor. A joint is being passed around. Gogol takes a hit, but as he sits there, holding his breath, he regrets it. He is already starved. Though it's close to 10 o'clock, dinner has yet to be served. Apart from the Chianti, the only offerings so far are a loaf of bread and a small bowl of olives. A blizzard of crumbs and pointy violet olive pits litter the tabletop. The bread has, like a hard, dusty cushion, is full of prune-sized holes and has a crust that hurts the roof of Gogol's mouth when he chews. They are at the home of Maushumi's friends, Astrid and Donald. It's a brownstone under renovation. Astrid and Donald are expecting their first child, are in the process of expanding their domain from a single floor of the house to the top 3. Thick plastic sheets hang from rafters, creating transparent, temporary corridors. Behind them, a wall is missing. Even at this hour, guests continue to arrive. They enter complaining of the cold that has persisted this far into spring, of the stinging, bothersome wind that tosses the treetops outside. They remove their coats, introduce themselves, pour themselves Chianti. If it happens to be their first time in the house, they eventually drift from the table and troop up the stairs to admire the pocket doors, the original tin ceilings, the vast space that will eventually become the nursery, the distant, sparkling view of Manhattan visible from the top floor. Gogol has been to the house before, a bit too frequently in his opinion. Astrid is a friend of Maushumi's from Brown. The first time he had met Donald and Astrid had been at his wedding. At least that's what Maushumi says. He doesn't remember them. They were living in Rome the first year that Gogol and Maushumi were together, on a Guggenheim that Astrid had gotten. But they have since moved back to New York, where Astrid had begun teaching film theory at the New School. Donald is a moderately talented painter of small, still lives of single, everyday objects. An egg, a cup, a comb, suspended against brightly colored backgrounds. Donald's rendition of a spool of thread, a wedding present to Gogol and Maushumi, hangs in their bedroom. Donald and Astrid are a languidly confident couple, a model Gogol guesses for how Maushumi would like their own lives to be. They reach out to people, hosting dinner parties, bequeathing little bits of themselves to their friends. They are passionate spokespeople for their brand of life, giving Gogol and Maushumi a steady, unquestionable stream of advice about quotidian things. They swear by a certain bakery on Sullivan Street, a certain butcher on Mott, a certain style of coffee maker, a certain Florentine designer of sheets for their bed. Their decrees drive Gogol crazy. But Maushumi is loyal. She regularly goes out of her way, and thus out of their budget, to buy bread at that bakery, meat at that butcher. He recognizes a few familiar faces tonight, Edith and Colin, who teach sociology at Princeton and Yale respectively, and Lewis and Blake, both PhD candidates like Maushumi at NYU. Oliver is an editor at an art magazine. His wife, Sally, works as a pastry chef. The rest are painter friends of Donald's, poets, documentary filmmakers. They are all married. Even now, a fact as ordinary, as obvious as this astonishes him. All married. But this is life now. The weekend sometimes more tiring than the work week. An endless stream of dinner parties, cocktail parties, occasional after 11 parties, with dancing and drugs to remind them that they are still young, followed by Sunday brunches full of unlimited Bloody Marys and overpriced eggs. They are an intelligent, attractive, well-dressed crowd. Also, a bit incestuous. The vast majority of them know each other from Brown, and Gogol can't ever shake the feeling that half the people in the room have slept with one another. There is the usual academic talk around the table, versions of the same conversation he can't participate in, concerning conferences, job listings, ungrateful undergraduates, proposal deadlines. At one end of the table, a woman with short red hair and cat's eye glasses is talking about a Brecht play she had once acted in San Francisco, performed fully in the nude. On the other end, Sally is putting the finishing touches on a dessert she has brought, intently assembling layers and covering them with glistening white meringue that shoots up like a dense thicket of flames. Astrid is showing a few people paint chips, which she has lined up in front of her like tarot cards, versions of an apple green she and Donald are considering for the front hallway. She wears glasses that might have belonged to Malcolm X. She eyes the paint chips with precision, though she seeks the advice of her guests. She has already made up her mind about which permutation of the shade she will choose. To Gogol's left, Edith is discussing her reasons for not eating bread. I just have so much more energy if I stay off wheat, she maintains. Gogol has nothing to say to these people. He doesn't care about their dissertation topics, or their dietary restrictions, or the color of their walls. In the beginning, these occasions hadn't been quite so excruciating. When Maushumi had first introduced him to her crowd, he and she would sit with their arms around each other, their fellow guests a footnote to their own ongoing conversation. Once, at a party at Sally and Oliver's, they had wandered off to make quick, giddy love in Sally's walk-in closet, piles of her sweaters looming over them. He knows that that sort of insular passion can't be sustained. Still, Maushumi's devotion to these people puzzles him. He looks at her now. She is lighting a Dunhill. Her smoking hadn't bothered him initially. He liked it, after sex, when she'd lean over the bedside table and strike a match, and he would lie beside her, listening to her exhale in the quiet, watching the smoke drift up over their heads. But these days, the stale smell of it, in her hair and on her fingertips, and in the bedroom where she sits typing, slightly disgusts him. And from time to time, he can't help but have a fleeting vision of himself, tragically abandoned as a result of her mild but persistent addiction. When he had admitted his fear to her one day, she laughed. "Oh, Nikhil," she had said, "you can't be serious." She is laughing now, nodding intently at something Blake is saying. She seems animated in a way he doesn't remember her having been in a while. He looks at her straight, smooth hair, which she has cut recently, so that it flips up at the ends. The glasses that only emphasize her beauty. Her pale, pretty mouth. He knows that the approval of these people means something to her, though what exactly he isn't sure. And yet, as much as Maushumi enjoys seeing Astrid and Donald, Gogol has recently begun to notice that she is gloomy in the aftermath, as if seeing them serves only to remind her that their own lives will never match her. The last time they had gone home after one of Astrid and Donald's dinner parties, she had picked a fight with him as soon as they had walked in the door, complaining about the noise on 3rd Avenue, about the sliding doors of the closets that always fall off the rails, about the fact that it's impossible to use the bathroom without being deafened by an exhaust fan. He tells himself that it's the stress. She has been studying for her orals, holed up in her carrel at the library until 9 o'clock most nights. He remembers how it was studying for his licensing exam, which he failed twice before passing. He remembers the sustained isolation it had demanded, speaking to no one for days at a time. And so, he doesn't say anything. Tonight, he had held out the hope that she'd use her orals as a reason to decline the invitation to Astrid and Donald's. But by now, he has learned that there is never a question of saying no when it comes to them. It was through Astrid and Donald that Maushumi had met her former fiancé, Graham. Donald had gone to prep with him, and he had given Maushumi's number to Graham when he had moved to Paris. Gogol doesn't like to think about the fact that Maushumi's connection to Graham persists through Astrid and Donald, that through them Maushumi has learned that Graham lives in Toronto now, is married and a father of twins. Back when Maushumi and Graham were together, they had made a foursome with Donald and Astrid, renting cottages together in Vermont, timeshares in the Hamptons. They try to incorporate Gogol into similar plans. This summer, for example, they are thinking of renting a house on the coast of Brittany. Though Astrid and Donald have welcomed Gogol heartily into their lives, sometimes he has the feeling they still think she's with Graham. Once Astrid even called him Graham by mistake. No one had noticed except Gogol. They had all been a little drunk, but he knew he had heard correctly. Toward the end of an evening much like this one. "Mo, why don't you and Graham take some of this pork Leon home?" Astrid had said, as they had been clearing the dishes. "It's great for sandwiches." At the moment, the guests are united by a single topic of conversation, talking about names for the baby. "What we want is something totally unique," Astrid is saying. Lately, Gogol has started to notice a trend. Now that they inhabit this world of couples, dinner party small talk gravitates to the naming of children. If a woman at the table happens to be pregnant, as Astrid is now, the subject is inevitable. "I always liked the names of popes," Blake says. "You mean like John and Paul?" Louis asks. "More like Innocent and Clement. There are nonsensical names like Jet and Tipper. These elicit groans. Someone claims to have once known a girl named Anna Graham. Get it? Anagram. And everyone laughs. Maushumi argues that a name like hers is a curse, complains that no one can say it properly, that the kids at school pronounced it Moosumi and shortened it to Moose. "I hated being the only Maushumi I knew," she says. "See now, I'd have loved that," Oliver tells her. Gogol pours himself another juice glass of Chianti. He hates contributing to these conversations, hates listening. A number of name books are passed around the table. Finding the perfect name, alternative baby names, the idiot's guide to naming your baby. One is called What Not to Name Your Baby. Pages are folded down, some with stars and checks in the margins. Some suggests Zachary. Someone else says she once had a dog named Zachary. Everyone wants to look up his or her own name to see what it means, is by turns pleased and disappointed. Both Gogol and Maushumi are absent from these books, and for the first time all evening he feels a hint of that odd bond that had first drawn them together. He goes over to where she is sitting, takes one of her hands, which have been resting flat on the surface of the table, her arms extended. She turns to look at him. "Hey there," she says, smiles at him, temporarily leaning her head on his shoulder, and he realizes that she is drunk. "What does Maushumi mean?" Oliver asks on the other side of her. "A damp southwesterly breeze," she says, shaking her head, rolling her eyes. "Sort of like the one outside?" "I always knew you were a force of nature," Astrid says, laughing. Gogol turns to Maushumi. "Really?" he says. He realizes that it's something he had never thought to ask about her, something he hadn't known. "You never told me that," he says. She shakes her head, confused. "I haven't?" It bothers him, though he's not quite sure why. But it's not the time to dwell on it, not in the middle of all this. He gets up to go to the bathroom. When he is finished, instead of returning to the dining room, he walks up a flight of stairs to check out the renovations. He pauses at the doors to a series of whitewashed rooms with nothing but ladders in them. Others are filled with boxes, stacked 6 or 7 deep. He stops to inspect some blueprints spread out on the floor. He remembers that when he and Maushumi were first dating, they had spent an entire afternoon in a bar, drawing a plan of the ideal house. He had argued for something modernist, full of glass and light, but she had wanted a brownstone like this one. In the end, they had designed something implausible, a townhouse of poured concrete with a glass facade. It was before they had slept together, and he remembers how they had both grown embarrassed when deciding where the bedroom should go. He ends up in the kitchen, where Donald is only now beginning to prepare spaghetti al vongole. It's an old kitchen from one of the former rental units, which they are still using until their new one is ready. Dingy linoleum and appliances lining a single wall remind Gogol of his former place on Amsterdam Avenue. On the stove is an empty, gleaming, stainless steel stockpot, so large that it covers 2 burners. Salad leaves are in a bowl covered with dampened paper towels. A heap of tiny, pale green clams, no larger than quarters, soak in the deep porcelain sink. Donald is tall, wearing jeans and flip-flops and a paprika-colored shirt whose sleeves are rolled up to just above his elbows. He is handsome, with patrician features and swept back, slightly greasy, light brown hair. He wears an apron over his clothes and is busily plucking leaves from an excessively large bunch of parsley. "Hey there," Gogol says. "Need any help?" "Nickel, welcome." Donald hands over the parsley. Be my guest. Gogol is grateful for something to do, to be occupied and productive, even in the role of sous chef to Donald. So, how are the renovations going? Don't ask, Donald says. We just fired our contractor. At this rate, our kid will already have moved out by the time the nursery is ready. Gogol watches as Donald begins to remove the clams from their bath, scrubbing the shells with something that looks like a tiny toilet bowl brush, then tossing them one by one into the stock pot. Gogol pokes his head into the pot and sees the vongole, and their shells uniformly parted in a quietly foaming broth. So when are you guys moving out to this neighborhood? Donald asks. Gogol shrugs. He has no interest in moving to Brooklyn, not in such proximity to Donald and Astrid anyway. I haven't really considered it. I prefer Manhattan. Mausumi does too. Donald shakes his head. You're wrong. Mausumi adores Brooklyn. We particularly had to kick her out after the whole Graham thing. The mention of the name pricks him, deflates him as it always does. She stayed here with you? Right down the hall. She was here for a couple of months. She was a real mess. I've never seen anyone so devastated. He nods. This was something else she had never told him. He wonders why. He hates the house suddenly, aware that it was here with Donald and Astrid that she spent her darkest hour, that it was here she had mourned for another man. But you're much better for her, Donald concludes. Gogol looks up, surprised. Don't get me wrong, Graham's a great guy, but they were too alike somehow, too intense together. Gogol does not find this observation particularly reassuring. He finishes plucking the last of the parsley leaves, watches as Donald grabs a knife and chops them, expertly and swiftly, a hand held flat over the top of the blade. Gogol feels incompetent all of a sudden. I've never quite figured out how to do that, he says. All you need is a really good knife, Donald tells him. I swear by these. Gogol is sent off with a stack of plates, a bunch of forks, and knives. On his way he pokes his head into the room down the hall where Mausumi had stayed. It's empty now, a drop cloth on the floor, a tangle of wires poking out of the center of the ceiling. He imagines her in a bed, in the corner, sullen, emaciated, a cloud of smoke over her head. Downstairs, he takes his place beside Mausumi. She kisses his earlobe. Where did you wander off to? Just keeping Donald company. The name conversation is still going full force. Collins says he likes names that signify a virtue. Patience, faith, chastity. He says his great-grandmother was named Silence, something nobody wants to believe. What about prudence? Isn't prudence one of the virtues? Donald says, coming down the stairs with a platter of spaghetti. The platter is lowered onto the table to scattered applause. The pasta is served, the plates passed around. It just feels like such a huge responsibility to name a baby. What if he hates it? Astrid frets. So he'll change it, Louis says. By the way, remember Joe Chapman from college? I heard he's a Joanne now. God, I would never change my name, Edith says. It's my grandmother's. Nickel changed his, Maushumi blurts out suddenly, and for the first time all evening, with the exception of the opera singers, the room goes completely quiet. He stares at her, stunned. He has never told her not to tell anyone. He simply assumed she never would. His expression is lost on her. She smiles back at him, unaware of what she has done. The dinner guests regard him, their mouths hanging open in confused smiles. What do you mean he changed his name? Blake asks slowly. Nickel, it wasn't the name he was born with. She nods, her mouth full, tossing a clamshell onto the table. Not his name when we were kids. What name were you born with? Astrid says, looking at him suspiciously, her eyebrows furrowed for effect. For a few seconds, he says nothing. Gogol, he finally says. It has been years since he has been Gogol to anyone other than his family, their friends. It sounds as it always does, simple, impossible, absurd. He stares at Maushumi as he says it, but she's too drunk to absorb his reproach. As in, the overcoat? Sally asks. I get it, Oliver says. Nick, Olai, Gogol. I can't believe you have kept this from us, Nick, Astrid chides. What in the world made your parents choose that name? Donald wants to know. He thinks back to the story he cannot bring himself to tell these people. At once as vivid and as elusive as it's always been. The capsized train in the middle of the night, his father's arm sticking through a window, the crumpled page of a book clutched in his fist. It's a story he had told Maushumi in the months after they had first met. He had told her of the accident, and then he had told her about the night his father had told him, in the driveway at Pemberton Road. He had confessed to her that he still felt guilty at times for changing his name, more so now that his father was dead. And she had assured him that it was understandable, that anyone in his place would have done the same. But now it's become a joke to her. Suddenly, he regrets having ever told Maushumi. He wonders whether she'll proclaim the story of his father's accident to the table as well. By morning, half the people in the room will have forgotten. It will be a tiny, odd fact about him, an anecdote perhaps for a future dinner party. This is what upsets him the most. "My father was a fan," he says finally. "Then maybe we should call the baby Verdi," Donald muses, just as the opera surges to its closing bars, and the tape ends with a click. "You're not helping," Astrid says, petulant, kissing Donald on the nose. Gogol watches them, knowing that it's all in jest. They are not the type to do something so impulsive, so naive, to blunder as his own parents had done. "Relax," Edith says. "The perfect name will come to you in time." Which is when Gogol announces, "There is no such thing." "No such thing as what?" Astrid says. "There is no such thing as a perfect name. I think that human beings should be allowed to name themselves when they turn 18, he adds. Until then, pronouns. People shake their heads dismissively. Maushumi shoots him a look that he ignores. The salad is served. The conversation takes a new turn, carries on without him. And yet, he can't help but recall a novel he had once picked up from the pile on Maushumi's side of the bed, an English translation of something French, in which the main characters were simply referred to, for hundreds of pages, as he and she. He had read it in a matter of hours, oddly relieved that the names of the characters were never revealed. It had been an unhappy love story. If only his own life were so simple.